In this video, I show you how to turn one single pallet board and less than an hour of your time into this framed shelf. Let's crack on, shall we? So I saw something on Etsy. It was cheap. It didn't cost much money at all, and yet I didn't want to pay for it. So I thought, I can make this. I can probably make this out of one pallet board. But that involved me doing some calculations, doing some measurements, and as you can see here, I seem pretty confident. Yeah, it's not going to last. Concentrating. Yep, that works. And now it's time to think. No. Oh, yep, chew the pencil just like you did at school. Tap your fingers, that's going to help your brain. But I took down the measurements of the plank, and I worked out the length, I worked out the width of the project, and decided that I could in fact build it all out of one board with some material to spare, just in case there's going to be any mistakes. Not that I would ever make them. So you might be wondering what's with the glass jar. Well, the glass jar is what I plan to have on this shelf, not just an empty pickle jar. Obviously it's going to have something in it, but I need it to fit and I need there to be some room above it. So here you can see, truly confident. The main reason for this small project was not just because I'd seen something on Etsy. I wanted to use my new toy. As you can see here, it takes a lot of cranking. It's supposed to be so that you can have very accurate small measurements, but it's a lot of work. And eventually, yes, I will not be using this on the floor. It is a bench top thicknesser, but I've only just got it. I haven't had a chance to build anything for it yet, but it was very impressive. Much better than my £150 screw fix bad boy. This took the planks through and they came out like butter smooth. I cannot tell you how good this thing is. For a fairly cheap price, it is mid-range. Anyway, I fed it through a few times, made sure that both sides of the plank were smooth. If you do not have a thicknesser, then of course you can do this by hand. You can do it with a piece of sandpaper and a block of wood if you must. I've got this new toy, I wanted to try it out, so I am not feeling guilty for it at all. Now, is it a true woodworking project unless you spend most of the time sanding more than anything else? Like I said, the thicknesser gave a butter smooth product, but I'd give it a quick once over here, but the main reason I picked up this sander is for the edges of the board. They were very rough and slightly bowed and warped, but for what I'm using them for here, that doesn't matter too much. We're creating a inverted commas rustic product, so it doesn't have to be perfect. The end of the board was a little scrappy, so I take about 10mm off just so that I've got a nice square edge to work with. After this, I'm measuring about 200mm, not about 200mm, actually 200mm, and that's going to be the shelf part of the framed shelf that my mason jar is going to sit on. So the idea behind this is that the frame will be like a thick picture frame, but the shelf needs to be deep enough to support something. Once that's been cut, I'm then going to take the remaining board over to the table saw, and I'm actually going to split that board in half because I want the shelf itself that the mason jar is going to sit on to come out further from the wall than the frame part itself. So I took the width measurement of the pallet board, which was around 90mm, set my table saw to around 45mm, and I just ran that board through, splitting it perfectly in half. My two lengths of pallet board actually gave me more material than I needed, so there will be a tiny bit of waste on this project, but I wanted to play it a bit safer when I was taking my measurements. Once I split the board in half, I measured lengths of 400mm and 20mm, and these were going to create the frame part of my framed shelf. So the shelf itself will be a total of 400mm in height and then it will be wider than 20mm in width, because the vertical boards will actually be on the outside. I'm not mitering anything here. I was looking for a quick build, something that I could do within an hour. So once I've measured those to length, give them a quick chop, and then it's on to everybody's favourite part, sanding again. I decided to take it old school here. I didn't even turn on the sander. I just got a piece of sandpaper and I was just smoothing out those edges. Any tear out that had happened from the chop saw, I was just getting rid of. And then I used the sandpaper simply just to smooth out some of the edges, make sure there's no splinters. Everything's going to be sanded afterwards. But to be honest, I think I'm going to burn this project. I think I'm going to take a blowtorch to it, in which case you don't want it to be too smooth. You want some of that grain exposed, you want the odd splinter, you get a much better effect. Here I'm just mocking up what it's going to look like. As you can see, the shelf itself protrudes from the main frame a little bit, and I've got an idea of what I want to put on this shelf. I've seen it on Etsy. In my mind, I know what I'm doing. I just don't know how to get there. As is the tagline of this channel, I don't know what I'm doing. Don't know if this is the right way, but in my mind, doweling this project together would make it stronger. This frame is not going to have a lot of weight on it, but it is going to be hanging off 1 or 2 nails on the wall, and then it's going to have a plant pot on it. Not huge load, but I wanted to make it a little bit stronger than just glue and nails. So I'm creating some dowels here with difficulty. Once cutting all the dowels, I just gave them a quick sand over on one end just to make knocking them into the holes a little bit easier. That's what she said. After deciding to include some very interesting content of me moving things out of the way, I decided to mock up this frame and put all the parts in place, choosing the best edges for the faces. Now, when working with pallet wood, you are going to have sides which you want to see and sides which you don't. And it's just the way of working with recycled wood. So I get my drill ready, I get my clamps, and then I decide to mock up the frame itself with the clamps, and I'm using a square here to make sure that everything is level and make sure there are 90-degree angles, choosing my faces and just seeing what this thing's going to look like once it's all assembled. Have I chosen the right lengths for the material? So what I have actually done is I have marked the width of the board on the outside of the frame. So that's so once the frame is all clamped together, I can come through with my drill and I can drill the holes for the dowels, and I kind of know where I'm supposed to be going. Over fuel and confidence, I pick up the drill just to realise I cannot get an angle on it because the clamps are in the way. So with a little bit of manoeuvring, I move the clamps, get a straight line on where the dowel needs to go, and make sure everything's square. And I suppose this is the most important part, making sure everything's square, everything's flush. And I'm going to put one dowel on the top of the frame and the bottom of the frame. The glue's going to hold that in place. I'm not worried about any kind of structure there. The dowel will do its job. On the shelf itself, I will use 2 dowels so that any weight that's on the front of the shelf that is not supported by the frame just has a little bit more integrity. So I grab my trusty hammer and a square and make sure the shelf is square with the frame and also square with the table. The table itself is perfectly level, so I know I can take a level off that. Once I'm happy, I take the drill and I drill 2 dowel holes. As I said earlier, this shelf is not going to be supporting any massive weight, but in my mind, having the 2 dowels in there would keep everything level and support the glue. Not sure that I need it, but better safe than sorry. Due to a minor recording error, which I'm going to say is the camera and definitely not my inability to press record, you didn't see me glue up and put the dowels in the end pieces, but I basically just glued the end grain of the horizontal pieces and the vertical parts that they would attach to, and then hammered in those dowels. Now here I've glued the end of the shelf part, and as you can see, the glue has given out. The nozzle has come off, there's glue everywhere, but I've basically glued the shelf to the frame, and I'm also going to squirt just a touch of glue into where the dowels are going to go. The glue going into the dowel holes, from what I understand, which is not a lot, is purely to hold the dowels in place. It's not actually to provide any kind of structure to the frame, but it will hold the dowels in and stop them slipping out over time. Can't imagine that's a thing, but sure, I read it somewhere. So give those dowels a little tap in, make sure that they are as in as they will go, and then, being the true professional I am, realise I haven't got enough dowels. I couldn't do the basic maths and realised that I need a total of 8, not 6. So I quickly cut a couple more, give them a quick sand over, and then I complete the other side. So the jar fits, and so apparently does my face. There it is. So this is the next day. If there's one thing I'm learning about woodworking, it involves a lot of waiting around and a lot of sanding. The glue's cured overnight, so it's time to take it out of clamps and see how much more sanding I've got to do. Like I said, this is a very rustic piece, which means that I can get away without much sanding. Once out of clamps, I use a flush cut saw to chop the end of those dowels off, and then I'll come back through in a minute with the sander and just make sure that they are sitting flush with the frame itself. So I'm reaching for the orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper. I've got some 240 grit and 180 grit there ready to do by hand, but I'm only going to use that to knock down some of the imperfections. As I said, my plan is to burn this, which actually does part of the job that sanding would normally do. It takes away and burns and chars some of that extra grain, and let's be honest, nobody's sitting on this and getting splinters in the backside. So when I saw these things on Etsy, I saw that generally the way they were mounted meant that the top of the frame itself was away from the wall, creating a weird shadow at the top and then none at the bottom. So I dug out these picture hanging bracket things that I've got lying around. I bought these in a bulk pack for about £1 many years ago. Now all I'm doing here is I'm insetting them into the frame itself so that they'll sit flush with the wall, so that the whole frame will sit against the wall without any kind of irregular gap at the top compared to the bottom. So I'm marking out where these are going to go and then trying to figure out how I'm going to inset them, because I am not particularly good with a chisel, and especially when working with cheap pallet wood. So all I'm doing here is I'm cutting a small notch about the depth of the bracket into the wood, and then I'm going to come through with the chisel and gently try to chisel some material away. Next comes my absolute favourite part, the bit where you get to use a blowtorch. So I'm using this map torch, I believe they call it. I think it's actually designed for plumbing, but the canisters themselves are quite cheap from Screwfix, and I got the nozzle attachment, whatever you would call it, from Amazon. I'll put a link in the description for those. But as you can see, because this wood is so soft, it burns really quickly. You get some amazing charring on the wood, and afterwards I'll come through with some Danish oil and just give it one coat of Danish oil, maybe two, depending on how much it soaks up, just to seal that char in. Because once you've finished charring it, if you rub your finger across it, your finger does come off black, so that Danish oil, as well as brushing it off, just helps to seal everything in. Once all burned, I come through with some 240 grit sandpaper, and I'm not trying to sand it down because you end up losing a lot of that accented grain. All I'm doing here is on the very corners of the wood where it's perhaps charred just a little bit, just brushing it back so that the Danish oil's got something to soak into. Because actually where it's really dark, you struggle to get any oil or anything to soak into. It's one way of waterproofing wood for use outdoors. So I just knock some of the rough edges off and then it's ready to go. So here I'm going to come through with some Danish oil that I got from Screwfix. It's quite cheap, less than £10 a tub, and you actually don't use very much at all. If I were using this for a desk or for a table, I'd use 2 or 3 coats of Danish oil, but this is just wall art, so I'm only going to come through with 1. But you'll see it takes some of that white out of the pine and it just accents that charring even more. I love this stuff. And it goes on really easily. You just slather as much on as it'll take with a brush, and then you come back through with a clean rag afterwards and just soak up any excess after waiting 10 minutes. And of course you should always wear gloves, otherwise you end up a greasy mess. After 10 minutes of patience, I'm coming back through with an old rag, which is actually just a cut up t-shirt, and I'm just wiping off any of the excess oil. Once you've done this, you should leave it for around 6 to 10 hours, depending on how warm it is where you are, depending on if it's your first coat of oil. The first coat tends to soak in and absorb a lot quicker. So I'm just brushing off the excess. If you don't, you'll end up with quite a sticky, tacky surface that tends to trap any kind of dust or hairs or anything that's flying around the room, and it will kind of build up on your product over time. Once I'm happy that that's all being wiped clean, I'm going to come through with these picture brackets and I'm putting those on those little inset sections that we created earlier, and I'm just using these small little screws that actually come with part of the pack. Like I say, these were pennies, and I'm going to use this to mount it onto the wall. And there it is, guys. This is the finished product, a framed shelf, or what I'm calling a framed shelf. I don't really know what it is other than a shelf with the frame around it. If you've gotten anything at all out of this video, please like and subscribe. It would mean the world to me and would really help me to grow this channel. Or if you want to comment about just how bad my joinery skills are, that would be helpful as well. Take care.